Nothing happens by chance, though the surface of life insists otherwise. Events arrive wearing the disguise of randomness, yet beneath them moves a silent order, as precise as breath, as inevitable as shadow. What you call coincidence is often the moment when the inner world brushes against the outer one, when an unseen necessity finally finds a visible form. You meet certain people at specific moments, not because fate is playful, but because something within you was ready to recognize them. The psyche does not wander aimlessly through life. It arranges encounters the way dreams arrange symbols. A word overheard, a delay, a loss, a sudden opportunity. Each becomes meaningful only when you look inward and ask why it stirred something already living inside you. When a door closes unexpectedly, it is rarely punishment. More often, it is the refusal of the unconscious to let you remain in a space that no longer reflects who you are becoming. Life interrupts your plans because your plans are often smaller than your potential. What feels like disruption is frequently correction. The patterns repeat until they are understood. The same relationship in different faces, the same fear in different situations, the same lesson disguised as new experience. This repetition is not cruelty, it is instruction. What you refuse to see consciously will return as circumstance, demanding attention through experience instead of thought. Chance is the name we give to meaning we have not yet interpreted. Once awareness deepens, randomness begins to dissolve. You start to notice how inner conflicts echo as outer obstacles, how unacknowledged desires summon events that force a decision, how growth announces itself first as discomfort. Nothing happens by chance because life is not merely happening to you, it is responding to you. The world mirrors the state of your inner alignment. When you are divided, reality fractures. When you are honest with yourself, reality simplifies. This is not mysticism. It is psychological truth lived out in time. To understand this is to stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and begin asking, "What part of me called this into being?" In that question, responsibility replaces helplessness. Meaning replaces chaos, and life, once seen as accidental, reveals itself as an unfolding dialogue between who you are and who you are meant to become. What appears as coincidence is often the meeting point of inner readiness and outer events, a moment where the invisible life of the psyche quietly intersects with the visible movement of the world. Long before an event arrives, something within has already shifted, prepared, or weakened. The conscious mind believes it is surprised, but the deeper layers recognize the moment instantly, as if remembering something that was always on its way. The feeling of this could not be random, does not come from logic, but from resonance, from the sudden alignment between what is happening outside and what has been forming silently within. The inner world is not passive. It is active, organizing experience long before awareness catches up. Desires unspoken, fears denied, questions avoided, all create a kind of internal tension. This tension seeks resolution, and when it cannot find expression through reflection, it seeks expression through life itself. Events then appear that match the inner state with uncanny precision. A person arrives who embodies what you have been avoiding. A loss occurs that mirrors an internal emptiness. An opportunity presents itself exactly when your old identity has begun to feel unbearable. Readiness does not always feel like confidence. Often it feels like restlessness, dissatisfaction, or confusion. These are signs that the psyche has outgrown its current conditions. When the outer world finally responds, it does so suddenly, without explanation, leaving the rational mind scrambling for causes. But the cause was already present, quietly maturing in the unconscious. The event is not the beginning, it is the visible climax of an invisible process. This is why two people can experience the same situation, and only one feels transformed by it. The outer event is identical, but the inner readiness is not. One person sees randomness, the other sees meaning. Meaning does not belong to the event itself. It belongs to the relationship between the event and the inner state of the person encountering it. Without readiness, even the most significant moment passes unnoticed. With readiness, even the smallest incident becomes a turning point. The psyche speaks in symbols, not in explanations. It does not announce change with clarity, but arranges circumstances that force attention. When you are ready to confront a truth, life places that truth in front of you, embodied as experience. When you are ready to let go, something is taken. When you are ready to grow, comfort is disturbed. These moments feel accidental only because the language being spoken is not the language of reason. Inner readiness often develops through suffering. Pain loosens old structures, weakens rigid identities, and opens cracks through which something new can emerge. In these cracks, sensitivity grows. You begin to notice subtleties you once ignored. You feel the weight of moments more deeply. This sensitivity is not weakness. It is preparation. It allows the psyche to recognize meaning when it appears externally. The meeting of inner and outer worlds is rarely gentle. It carries the force of necessity. When the psyche is ready, it no longer negotiates. It demands expression. The world then responds as if on cue, not because the world is orchestrated for you, but because your perception has reached a point where alignment becomes visible. What you once dismissed as coincidence now feels personal, intimate, almost deliberate. This perception can be unsettling. It removes the comfort of believing life is random and therefore blameless. If events correspond to inner states, then avoidance has consequences and awareness has power. This realization shifts responsibility inward. You begin to sense that ignoring your inner life does not make it disappear. It simply ensures it will return disguised as fate. Readiness is not something you choose consciously. It accumulates through lived experience. Each disappointment, each contradiction, each unresolved question adds pressure. When the pressure becomes sufficient, something must change. The outer event is simply the release valve. It appears suddenly, but it has been prepared slowly. When people say everything happens for a reason, they often mean it superficially as comfort, but the deeper truth is less reassuring and more demanding. The reason is not external justification, it is internal necessity. The reason is the psyche insisting on movement, on development, on becoming more whole. The meeting point of inner readiness and outer events is where this insistence becomes unavoidable. At this point, resistance feels futile. The event carries a strange authority, as if arguing with it would mean arguing with yourself. Even when the experience is painful, there is often a quiet sense of rightness beneath the distress. Something clicks into place, something long dormant wakes up, something false begins to fall away. This is why certain moments divide life into before and after, not because the event was extraordinary, but because the inner readiness had reached completion. The psyche had finished preparing the ground. The seed could finally break the surface. What looks like chance is actually timing, precise and uncompromising. To live without awareness of this process is to feel victimized by randomness. To live with awareness is to recognize patterns forming long before they manifest. You start to see how your inner life is in constant conversation with the world, how attention alters experience, how neglect invites disruption. The world becomes less chaotic, not because it changes, but because you begin to recognize the logic of meaning operating beneath appearances. In this recognition, coincidence loses its innocence. It becomes a message, a signal, a response. Not every event is profound, but every profound event arrives when something inside is ready to receive it. The meeting point is never early and never late. It occurs precisely when the inner structure can no longer remain as it was, when the old form has weakened enough to allow the new to enter, When the psyche has quietly decided that it is time for life to speak back, repeating life patterns exist to reveal what remains unconscious, moving through time like a loop that tightens until it is finally seen. Life rarely teaches through explanation, it teaches through repetition. The psyche returns to the same themes again and again, not because it enjoys suffering, but because unresolved material continues to seek expression. What is not made conscious does not disappear. It waits, gathers energy, and eventually arranges circumstances that mirror it back to you in lived form. These patterns often appear first in subtle ways. Similar disappointments with different names, familiar emotional reactions triggered by new situations, the sense that you have been here before, even when the surface details have changed. At first, the mind insists these are coincidences or bad luck. But repetition is never random. Repetition is instruction. It is the psyche's way of saying that something essential has not yet been integrated. The unconscious does not speak in words. It speaks in experiences, in emotional reactions that feel disproportionate, in choices that seem automatic, in attractions and aversions that defy logic. When these inner forces remain unseen, they shape behavior from behind the scenes. You believe you are choosing freely, yet you are often reenacting the same script, written long before awareness took the stage. Relationships are one of the most common arenas for repetition. The same dynamics replay with different people, carrying the same emotional weight, the same disappointments, the same unmet needs. You may change partners, environments, even identities, but the core pattern persists. This is not punishment, it is exposure. Life places the unresolved in front of you until you recognize it as your own reflection rather than someone else's flaw. The repetition continues because recognition has not yet occurred. Awareness breaks the cycle, but awareness requires honesty, and honesty threatens the image we have of ourselves. It is easier to blame circumstances than to confront inner contradictions. It is easier to call it fate than to admit participation. As long as the ego defends its innocence, the unconscious must continue to speak through repetition. Fear plays a central role in maintaining these patterns. Fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of inadequacy, fear of change. These fears operate quietly, shaping decisions without ever being named. They guide you toward familiar suffering because familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar growth. The psyche chooses what it knows over what it does not, even when what it knows is harmful. Patterns also repeat around success and failure. Some people repeatedly approach opportunities only to sabotage them at the final moment. Others remain stuck in preparation, never fully stepping forward. These are not accidents, they are expressions of inner conflicts between desire and self, belief between ambition and fear. Until these conflicts are brought into awareness, life will continue to stage them externally. The intensity of repetition often increases over time. What begins as mild discomfort becomes sharper, more disruptive. The psyche escalates when it is ignored. If subtle signals are dismissed, louder ones follow. What was once an emotional unease may become a crisis. What was once a warning may become a collapse. This escalation is not cruelty, it is urgency. Repetition is also tied to identity. Many patterns persist because they support a familiar self-image, even if that image is limiting. Victimhood, superiority, self-sacrifice, control, avoidance. These identities provide structure. Letting go of them feels like losing oneself. The psyche resists this loss even when growth depends on it. So the pattern repeats, preserving the known self at the cost of development. To observe a repeating pattern without judgment is the beginning of change. Observation creates distance. Distance weakens compulsion. When you can watch yourself reacting instead of immediately identifying with the reaction, something shifts. The pattern begins to lose its grip. What was once automatic becomes questionable. What was once inevitable becomes optional. This does not mean the pattern disappears immediately. Awareness is not a switch, it is a process. The unconscious does not surrender all at once. It tests whether awareness is stable or fleeting. Patterns may repeat again, but with less intensity, offering opportunities to respond differently. Each conscious response loosens the structure that once felt permanent. There is often grief involved in this process. Grief for the time lost repeating the same lessons. Grief for the version of yourself that believed differently. Grief for the illusions that once provided comfort. This grief is not a setback. It is integration. It signals that something unconscious is becoming part of the conscious personality. Repeating patterns are not enemies to be destroyed, but messages to be understood. They point toward unfinished business within the psyche. When approached with curiosity instead of resistance, they reveal hidden needs, suppressed emotions, and neglected potentials. What once felt like a trap becomes a map. Freedom does not come from escaping patterns by changing circumstances alone. It comes from changing the relationship to the inner forces that generate them. Once these forces are acknowledged, they no longer need to manifest as fate. They can be expressed through choice, creativity, and deliberate action. Life continues to repeat what the psyche refuses to see, not to torment, but to complete. Completion requires consciousness. When the lesson is finally integrated, the pattern dissolves naturally, without struggle. What replaces it is not perfection, but movement, not certainty, but alignment. The cycle ends not with victory, but with understanding, and the space it leaves behind allows something new to emerge where the old repetition once stood disruption and loss function as psychological correction, not punishment, arriving at moments when inner imbalance can no longer be maintained. The mind interprets loss as cruelty because it measures life by attachment, by continuity, by the preservation of what is familiar. Yet the psyche measures life by growth, by movement, by the capacity to adapt and expand. When these two measures fall out of alignment, disruption becomes inevitable. Loss rarely targets what is essential. It targets what has become rigid. What collapses is often what you have mistaken for stability. Roles, relationships, identities, routines, beliefs that once served a purpose begin to harden over time. When they no longer reflect the person you are becoming, they turn into obstacles rather than supports. The psyche does not negotiate with obstacles, it removes them. Disruption feels violent because it bypasses conscious consent. You would not willingly surrender what has given you meaning, even when that meaning has expired. So life intervenes. It interrupts your narrative abruptly, tearing away continuity and forcing you into uncertainty. This uncertainty is not a void, it is a recalibration. It strips away false certainty so that a more authentic orientation can emerge. Psychological correction works from the inside out. Before anything is lost externally, it has already lost its vitality internally. You may continue to hold on to it, but the emotional charge has weakened. Interest fades, satisfaction diminishes, the sense of purpose becomes hollow. These are early signals. When they are ignored, the psyche escalates, translating inner decay into outer disruption. Many losses feel undeserved because they are not caused by conscious wrongdoing. But psychological correction is not moral. It does not reward or punish. It restores balance. If an identity becomes inflated, it will be deflated. If dependency replaces autonomy, separation will occur. If avoidance dominates life, confrontation will arise. The psyche seeks equilibrium, not comfort. Disruption often exposes the difference between who you are and who you believe yourself to be. When familiar structures disappear, the self-image that depended on them collapses as well. This can feel like annihilation. Without the role, without the relationship, without the status, you are forced to encounter yourself without props. This encounter is terrifying because it reveals both emptiness and potential. The instinctive response to loss is resistance. The mind fights to restore what was, clinging to memory, replaying alternatives, bargaining with reality. This resistance prolongs suffering. Correction does not reverse itself under protest. The more fiercely you cling, the more painful the separation becomes. Acceptance does not mean approval, it means recognizing necessity. Disruption clears space. It dismantles structures that limit growth and creates room for reorganization. This space initially feels unbearable because it lacks form. Humans seek form for safety, but form also confines. The absence of form allows new configurations to appear. Creativity, insight, and transformation require emptiness before they can take shape. Loss also humbles the ego. It reveals the illusion of control. You realize that your plans were provisional, your certainties fragile. This humility is not degradation, it is grounding. It reconnects you to reality as it is rather than as you wish it to be. From this grounded position, perception sharpens. You begin to see options that were invisible before. Psychological correction often repeats until alignment is restored. If the lesson of a loss is avoided, similar disruptions will follow. Different circumstances, same impact. The psyche insists. It will dismantle whatever structure continues to support imbalance. This persistence is not hostility. It is commitment to development. Disruption also tests values. When comfort is removed, what remains matters more clearly. You discover what you can live without and what you cannot. Many things you once defended reveal themselves as unnecessary. Other things, previously neglected, prove essential. Loss clarifies priorities not through reflection but through lived experience. The aftermath of disruption is rarely immediate clarity. Confusion lingers, identity fragments, direction feels uncertain. This is not failure, it is transition. The psyche requires time to reorganize. Premature conclusions freeze the process. Remaining with uncertainty allows deeper insight to form. Correction reshapes character. Endurance grows, compassion deepens, rigidity softens. When loss is integrated rather than resisted, it expands psychological capacity. You become less dependent on external stability and more anchored internally. This anchoring does not eliminate pain, but it prevents collapse. Disruption is often the only language strong enough to break unconscious allegiance to outdated patterns. Words would not suffice. Advice would be ignored. Only experience carries enough weight to override habit. Loss delivers that weight. What feels like life turning against you is often life turning you back toward yourself. When something essential is neglected, correction redirects attention. When something false is overvalued, correction removes it. This redirection is harsh only when judged by comfort rather than by truth. To see disruption as correction is not to romanticize suffering. Pain remains pain, but meaning changes the relationship to pain. It transforms chaos into necessity, despair into instruction. Loss then becomes part of a larger movement rather than a dead end. Psychological correction does not promise compensation. What replaces what was lost will not be identical. The psyche does not restore the old, it creates the new. Expecting replacement in familiar form leads to disappointment. Growth requires unfamiliar outcomes. When disruption has completed its work, a quiet realignment occurs. Not excitement, not relief, but a subtle sense of congruence. Life feels less forced. Choices feel less reactive. Direction emerges without urgency. Loss takes away what no longer belongs, so that what does can finally appear. It dismantles illusions of permanence, so that flexibility can develop. It corrects deviation not through explanation, but through experience, leaving behind a psyche more truthful, more resilient, more capable of bearing reality as it is rather than as it was once imagined. Meaning emerges when responsibility replaces the belief in randomness, shifting the individual from passive observer to active participant in life. As long as events are seen as accidental, the self remains detached, reacting rather than engaging, interpreting experience as something imposed from outside. Randomness offers comfort because it removes obligation. If nothing has meaning, nothing is required. Yet this comfort is shallow, and beneath it grows a quiet sense of powerlessness. When responsibility enters awareness, perception changes. Responsibility here does not imply blame or moral judgment, but ownership of inner response. It is the recognition that while not all events are chosen, the way they are integrated shapes the course of one's life. This recognition dissolves the illusion of chaos and replaces it with a sense of dialogue between the inner world and outer reality. Randomness fragments experience. Responsibility organizes it. When you begin to ask what an event demands of you internally rather than why it happened externally, experience becomes coherent, pain becomes informative, obstacles become directional, even confusion gains structure, pointing toward areas where awareness is incomplete. Taking responsibility exposes inner contradictions. You begin to see how certain reactions repeat, how expectations influence outcomes, how avoidance invites confrontation. This exposure is uncomfortable because it challenges innocence. Yet innocence preserved at the cost of awareness keeps life small. Responsibility expands life by revealing participation in its unfolding. Meaning does not arrive fully formed. It is constructed through reflection and action. Each time responsibility is taken, even partially, meaning deepens. You notice how attention alters experience, how intention shifts probability, how honesty clarifies decision making. Life feels less arbitrary not because it becomes predictable, but because it becomes interpretable. The belief in randomness separates the individual from life. Responsibility reunites them. Events are no longer external assaults, but communications requiring response. This does not grant control over outcomes, but it restores agency over direction. Direction is enough to sustain meaning, even in uncertainty. As responsibility grows, victimhood weakens. The narrative of being at the mercy of fate loses its grip. In its place emerges a quieter strength, rooted not in dominance, but in awareness. This strength allows engagement with difficulty without collapse and acceptance without resignation. Meaning is sustained through this engagement. It is not a conclusion, but an ongoing process. Each encounter, each disruption, each unexpected turn becomes material for integration. Life reveals itself not as a series of random events, but as a continuous invitation to participate consciously, to respond with awareness, and to shape the inner life in alignment with the demands of reality.